Good evening, and welcome to Canvar Hall at the Jewish Community Center of San Francisco. Please be respectful of your neighbor by silencing your cell phone now. Photographs or recording during the event are not permitted. Emergency exits are located on both sides of the theater and at the top of the balcony. Please take a moment to find the exit nearest you. Thank you.
Hello. Welcome everyone to the second event of the spring semester for the University of San Francisco Swig program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice, where tonight we have the honor of offering our 8th annual Social Justice Lecture in partner with the Jewish Community Center of San Francisco. Our esteemed guests this evening, Rabbi Jill Jacobs, Rabbi Michael Lezak, and Dolores Canales will be formally introduced shortly. My name is Aaron Hahn Tapper, and I have the privilege of directing the JSSJ program of USF since 2008, the first and only academic program in the history of the United States linking Jewish studies with social justice. In addition to offering numerous courses related to this interdisciplinary field, courses like social justice, activism, and Jews, the Jewish American experience through graphic novels, forgiving the unforgivable, the ethics of apologies, and more, our program also offers a minor in Jewish Studies and Social Justice, the only minor of its kind. We also offer a number of annual events. Each fall, we have a speaker series focused on Jewish identities, highlighting the rich diversity of Jews in terms of ethnicity, gender, national sensibilities, sex, sexual orientation, race, and a number of other social identities. Each fall, we also offer an annual human rights lecture. And each spring, aside from the Social Justice Lecture, we also have an annual Social Justice Passover Seder, dealing with events such as poverty in Haiti, genocide in Chad, the Sudan and the Congo, gender justice, and on. I'm not going to go through all of the events that we have this semester because I really want to get to our program. Having had dinner with our 3 guests, there's a lot of rich conversation to be had. So I will skip ahead here. If you want to learn more about the JSSJ program, there's a table outside in the atrium, or the reception area, and you can also sign on to our listserv. Thank you in particular to the staff of the JCC of San Francisco for your assistance in making tonight's program happen. Thank you to the University of San Francisco Department in Theology and Religious Studies for co-sponsoring this event. Now, to begin officially. In the first book of the Bible, Genesis, the human species is described as starting off on what we might very generously describe as the wrong foot. Adam and Eve's 2 children, Cain and Cain and Abel, have some sort of problem, resulting in the older brother murdering the younger one. There are many interesting pieces of this narrative, but I'd like to touch on one in particular. After Cain carries out this heinous act, God asks Cain about his brother's whereabouts. Cain impudently replies, "Am I my brother's keeper?" Now, from the modern-day vantage point, the character in the story named God created the universe just a couple chapters prior. So given that God just created the world, God kind of already knows the answer to the question. Thus, where's your brother is rhetorical. As for Cain's response, "Am I my brother's keeper?" this is also rhetorically answered with a resounding yes, not then per se, but in and through the stories laid out through the rest of the Torah, the 5 books of Moses. The question of whether or not each of us is responsible to our fellow human is not a mere theoretical question. It plays out in each of our lives every day. The person living on a San Francisco street asking for food or money, who we all too often pretend not to notice, the stories we read in the daily newspaper or through Facebook about unjust things happening, whether at home or around the world, all of these instances of injustice are interconnected. All of these daily occurrences are undergirded by the idea of intersectionality, the notion that all forms of oppression, all forms of destruction are interrelated. Judging a sister by the color of her skin is akin to judging a brother by his sexual orientation. Mistreating a woman because of her ethnicity is akin to mistreating a brother because of his nationality. Intersectionality, however, is not just about how all forms of justice and injustice are interrelated, how the structures of oppression of one group are linked to the oppression of another. It's also, for me at least, about how the only way to move things forward is to consider one another as integral pieces of the puzzle. Whether a student or professor, activist, organizer, 20-something or 80-something, all of us have a role to play in taking responsibility for improving our world, for working to transform the what is into the what can be. Our three guests this evening, in many ways, embody that notion of how can I better the world. It's my pleasure to introduce to you tonight, first and foremost, Rabbi Jill Jacobs, who will be leading our 8th annual Social Justice Lecture in conversation with Rabbi Michael Lezak and Dolores Canales. Jill is one of the most important voices in the Jewish American communities today. As Executive Director of Truah, the Rabbinic Call for Human Rights, Rabbi Jacobs is at the vanguard of the Jewish human rights movement, mobilizing 1,800 rabbis and cantors, as well as tens of thousands of American Jews to protect human rights in North America, Israel, and the occupied Palestinian territories. Widely regarded as a leading voice on Jewish social justice, she's the author of Where Justice Dwells, There Shall Be No Needy, and has been named 3 times to the Forward's list of 50 influential American Jews and to Newsweek's list of 50 most influential rabbis in America every year since 2009. As a contemporary of mine in the institutional Jewish communities, I've personally followed Rabbi Jacobs' career since she was a rabbinical student. It's truly been amazing to watch her rise in stardom in the best of ways over the last 2 decades. Rabbi Jacobs will be joined in conversation today by Rabbi Michael Lezak, co-chair of the Board of Directors of Truah, the Rabbinic Call for Human Rights. After serving as rabbi at San Rafael's congregation Rodef Shalom for 14 years, this past year he began a new position as a rabbi in the Center for Social Justice at Glide. As many know, Glide Memorial United Methodist Church and the affiliated Glide Foundation are one of the most important and active social justice communities in the entire city of San Francisco, renowned for offering daily free meals to those in need, running a women's center for survivors of domestic violence, and a range of countless other amazing social justice programs. Rabbi Lezak is part of the Glide team focusing on helping those local people in immediate need of food, shelter, and security. Our third guest this evening is Dolores Canales, a California activist at the forefront of the movement to reform the prison and jail systems. A few short years ago, Ms. Canales played a vital role in getting off the ground 6x9, a virtual reality experience of solitary confinement, an immersive audiovisual storytelling experience shown at notable venues such as Sundance and Tribeca. She also has particular insight into the evils of solitary confinement. In 1994, her son, John Martinez, was sentenced to prison. For most of the time since then, he has served his sentence in solitary confinement. Twice a day, food is shoved through a slot in the door to his cell. Once a day, he's permitted to exercise alone in a cement yard the length of 3 cells, with the roof partially open to the sky. Johnny is one of numerous incarcerated men who has participated in hunger strikes to bring attention to the horrific and subhuman experience of being put into confined isolation. Among other organizations, Ms. Canales is active with California Families to Abolish Solitary Confinement, which she co-founded. She's also the director of talent development with the Bail Project, which is working to disrupt the unjust bail system, returning to the restorative assumption of innocence. Tonight's program will go as follows. After the 3 guests come out, each of them will take a few minutes to share how and why they are involved with prison justice reform. Thereafter, they will be in conversation with one another, and time permitting, we will have a Q&A. But before I welcome them out, I want to bring a voice into this conversation that can't be present tonight. And this one individual will be representative of all of those who can't be present tonight, those individuals who are incarcerated as we speak. Thankfully, due to a colleague, Professor Shana Hammerman, we have a letter from one of her students in the Prison University Project, Rasan Thomas, who is an incarcerated individual at San Quentin. And I'm going to read a letter that he wrote to be read in particular at this evening's event. Striving to keep the promise of never again, he says, Jewish people often stand in solidarity with those of us that are marginalized. In the 1960s, that was blacks during the Civil Rights Movement. Now that mass incarceration has become the civil rights issue of our time, it has become harder for us to march side by side with almost 1 million black people behind bars. In order to stand in solidarity, we need to overcome the barriers hampering marching together. His name is Rasan Thomas, the co-founder of Prison Renaissance, an organization dedicated to creating opportunities for incarcerated people to participate in communities that need our wisdom. He says, we have experiences that make us expert, street credibility that make us effective in peer-to-peer mentoring, and knowledge on how to turn someone's life around the way we turned around our own. Through creative means, like an online journal, using collect calls to participate in college classroom discussions, giving lectures, and participating in art installations from San Quentin, for instance, we're getting the voices of incarcerated people into society. He writes, it's important to include the input of incarcerated people in our battle for social justice. For example, he says, I watched several people weigh in on what to do about school shootings on a recent morning news show. They were all either senators or members of the press. None of the experts, he says, mentioned speaking to any of the school shooters or anyone that lived a violent life who has since changed their ways. What will stop mass shootings, he says, is learning how to spot the effects of trauma and getting people the resources to heal. He says, I know that from personal experience. At 17 years old, he saw his little brother shot right in front of him, and he ran, leaving the 14-year-old behind. When the police didn't catch the shooter, Rasan became enraged at them, at the shooter, and at himself. Thereafter, he writes, I carried a gun and an intense anger ready to be unleashed when next provoked. He shot people, yet throwing him in prison, even for life, he says, didn't stop his violent behavior, nor did it protect society. Just like trauma made him violent, he says, I maintain the power to traumatize other people who leave prison every day, like staff guards and parolees. But what has stopped me, he says, from ever harming another human being again is self-help groups started by incarcerated people working with community volunteers. They helped me heal, and I haven't committed an act of violence in over a decade. He ends by saying, I believe a solution based on treating trauma will significantly reduce violence, not just in schools, but also in ghettos and prisons. However, we should begin by including the voices of the real experts, incarcerated people who were violent and have since changed their lives. Go to prisonrenaissance.org, learn how you can include the voices of incarcerated people in the battle for social justice. Please join me in welcoming our three guests, Rabbi Jill Jacobs, Rabbi Michael Lezak, and Dolores Canales, to the JCC of San Francisco.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hantapper, for having us here. It's really wonderful to be here, and especially in the context of this program, this amazing program that you've created in Judaism and social justice. My name is Rabbi Jill Jacobs. I'm the executive director of TRUA, which, as you heard, is an organization that mobilizes about 2,000 rabbis across the US and Canada to work on human rights issues, both here in North America and also in Israel and the occupied territories. And we as an organization have been working on issues of incarceration for about 5 or 6 years, with a particular focus on solitary confinement. I want to start by telling a story about how that came to be. As an organization, we came to the issue of solitary confinement because we had been working on torture. We try to pick up issues that are fun to talk about over a light dinner conversation. So we started working on the issue of torture in 2004. This was before I came to the organization. I've been executive director since 2011. But right after Abu Ghraib, the organization picked up torture as its first US-based human rights issue. We had just started in 2002, so this was really our first campaign to lift up a religious voice against torture together with other religious groups as part of the National Religious Campaign Against Torture. And so we worked on the issue of state-sponsored torture for about 10 years until in 2014, the Senate torture report finally came out. Not perfect, there are a lot of issues with it, but we felt like that was a good time to close down that work and to start in on some other human rights work. Around that same time, a number of our partners in the community that had been working on torture started looking at issues of torture inside of US prisons, particularly solitary confinement, because according to the international definition of torture, keeping somebody in solitary confinement for more than 15 days constitutes torture, as do some other practices like shackling women, pregnant women during labor. So we started looking at that issue of torture, practices that count as torture inside of US prisons. And we started having a conversation within the organization about whether we should take on solitary confinement as well as broader issues of incarceration. And at one particular board meeting, I don't think that Rabbi Lezak was on the board yet or at that meeting, but at one particular board meeting about 5 or 6 years ago, our board was talking about whether we could ever get the Jewish community to care about incarceration. And the feeling around the table was, no way. There is no way we're going to get Jews to care about incarceration. We're not affected by it as a community. We're not connected to it. There is absolutely no way that our community is going to get involved in this issue. Everybody would like to, but there's no way. And at a certain point during this meeting, this was our board, which at the time was all rabbis. That's no longer true. We've expanded. But at the time, it was a group of rabbis. And at some point, somebody said, well, how many of you have ever visited a congregant in prison? Every single hand went up. And then there was just shock in the room because the rabbis were turning to each other and saying, wait a second, I thought that was, you also had that experience? Or I thought I was the only one. And there is such shame around incarceration within the Jewish community that even rabbis visiting congregants in prison, there's no shame around that. And yet, each one thought that it was such a singular experience that they had never considered that, in fact, every rabbi in a particular room might have had that experience, that actually it is not as unusual an experience as one might think. And then the conversation shifted, and we started talking about all of the ways in which incarceration affects really every single one of us, whether it's because we have a family member or a friend or a family member of a friend who's in prison, whether it's because we are connected professionally to the criminal justice system, whether we are lawyers or judges or we sit on a jury maybe once every few years as a volunteer, that there are many ways that we're connected to that system. And all of us, every single one of us in our society is affected by the fact that we have a criminal justice system that actually doesn't do a particularly good job of keeping anybody safe. Either people who are convicted of crimes or people who are affected by crimes. That actually we have a system that is putting people away without keeping any of us safer. So the conversation shifted, and we've been involved in issues of incarceration ever since. I just want to throw out a couple of statistics just to say why it was that we as an organization, I believe that all of us should see why we as an organization saw the issue of criminal justice and incarceration as a crucial human rights issue, and why I think all of us as a society should look at this as one of the most important human rights issues in America today. The United States, as you might know, has the highest rate of incarceration in the world. 25% of incarcerated people in the world are in this country. When we think about the countries with the worst human rights records, we might think about China or Russia. We think about places that put people in prison for all sorts of political reasons, and yet the United States has by far the highest percentage in the world of people in prison, both per capita and in raw numbers. And of course we know that race plays a major role in who goes to prison. So there are a million statistics we could throw out, but I'll just throw out one, which is that drug use is pretty much the same among people of all sorts, of all races. And yet, when you look at who's in prison for drug use, 3 times as many black people are in prison for drug use as white people. It's not that the level of drug use is higher, but the police go out and they're looking in certain neighborhoods, in certain areas, for people who they can arrest for drug use. So incarceration is one of the major racial issues in our country, and it's one of the most important human rights issues in our country, and it's very much a hidden issue because people who are incarcerated are not living down the block from us. They're often put in very far away places. I'm in New York, and some of the major prisons in New York are basically practically in Canada, right by the Canadian border. Here we're going to hear a lot more about Pelican Bay, which is, what, about 5 hours north of here. Until I heard about Pelican Bay, I didn't know that you could drive 5 hours north of San Francisco and still be in California, but I'm told that you can. I want to say just a word about what Judaism has to say about incarceration and about criminal justice. There are a few themes that come into Jewish conversations about how we create a criminal justice system. First thing I want to say as a frame is a lot of times when people think about Jewish law, the first thing that comes to mind is what are you allowed to eat, what are you not allowed to eat, what are you allowed to do on Shabbat, what are you not allowed to do, what are all of the different laws that come into play about Passover, about the Passover Seder. But in fact, there's an entire world of Jewish law that is about issues of how we're supposed to live together in society. Everything from law about how employers and employees are supposed to interact with each other, landlords and tenants, and law about how to create a criminal justice system. There are a few themes that come up in all of the Jewish legal conversations about criminal justice. One is that we have to preserve the dignity of the perpetrator or the accused perpetrator. And I'll just mention one of my favorite biblical lines about this in the book of Deuteronomy. There's a description of a punishment of somebody who's done a crime. We don't know what crime, but there's a punishment of somebody who's done a crime. And it says that the person shouldn't be punished too much because the worry is, the text says that there's a concern that nikla achicha beinecha, that your brother or sister, we might say, that your sibling might be degraded in front of your eyes. So this is crucial, that the text calls this person who's committed some major crime, has been punished for it. The text insists that this person is your brother, or maybe if it were written today, your brother or your sister. That when we look at this person, we don't look at them as a perpetrator, as somebody who's defined by the crime that they've done. We look at them as a member of our family, and we want to make sure that they are not degraded, just like we wouldn't want any member of our family to be degraded, no matter what it is that they did, no matter how angry we might be at them in that moment. So the dignity of the perpetrator. Second, Judaism tries to create a system where we make sure that that all of us are safe, that we want to protect any potential victims who, I want to be clear that it's not like some people are potential victims and some people are potential perpetrators. We're all any of those. There's a desire to create a system that is as safe as possible for people who are potentially victims, and that includes mandating that you make sure that if there's a stranger in your town, somebody who's passing through, you want to make sure to accompany them out and toward the next town so that they won't be vulnerable on the road where there might be highway robbers waiting for them. So there are a lot of laws and regulations about how to keep people safe in our society. The third principle is that when we look at conviction in Judaism, we try to get convictions beyond any doubt, especially for serious crimes. So in the US system, we talk about beyond any reasonable doubt. In the Jewish criminal justice system, it's beyond any doubt. In Judaism, there is capital punishment in the Bible, but the ancient rabbis of the Talmud, which is codified around the 7th century of the Common Era, effectively legislate capital punishment out of existence. And one of the ways that they do that is by making it virtually impossible to ever carry out capital punishment. Because in order to kill somebody, in order to carry out capital punishment, a number of things have to be true, including you have to have 2 eyewitnesses who both saw the crime. They have to have seen it from the exact same vantage point. So you can't have a situation where one of them's looking out one window and another one's looking from across the street. They can't be related to each other. They can't be related to the perpetrator or the victim. They have to give a warning before the crime happens. So imagine the scene. You're standing on the street with your friend, who's going to be the other eyewitness, and you see somebody pick up a gun, point it at somebody else. You have to say, hey, do you know that you're about to commit a crime that if you do that, then the punishment is capital punishment? And the person has to say, why, yes, I do. Right? So you see how this is not going to lead to capital punishment ever happening. And the rabbis like to ask questions not only about the crime, but also about other things in the environment. Famously, one rabbi liked to ask about the stalks of the figs. So imagine you have just seen a murder, and you're being questioned as an eyewitness, and they ask you, what was a murder weapon? What was the person wearing? All sorts of things like that. And then they say, the fig trees, were the stalks of the figs, were they green or brown? I don't know. I wasn't looking at the figs. I was watching this murder. Hey, but they're asking so many questions because they want to make sure that there is absolutely no doubt. So we know from the US system, of course, that there is a lot of doubt that enters, and we unfortunately have too many situations of having innocent people who are on death row. So the Jewish system of making sure there's no doubt, because you even know about the fig trees, tries to make sure the capital punishment actually never happens. And prison is not a part of the classical Jewish criminal justice system as a punishment. There are a few cases where there's some kind of detention until the trial is finished, if you think somebody might escape. There's a few places where you might use that kind of detention in the Bible when Moses doesn't know what to do with somebody who's violated a law. That person's put in some kind of detention while Moses goes and asks God what to do and then comes back. And so prison is not considered something that is a normal part of the system, except in a couple of cases. One of those cases is when there's a situation of manslaughter. So somebody has accidentally killed somebody else, and probably that victim's family is going to want to get revenge. And so there's an entire system created of cities of refuge where the person who committed the manslaughter goes so that they can be protected from the person who's going to try to run after them. But I want to be clear that those are not prisons. They are cities, and there are a lot of regulations that are created to ensure that those are livable places. So the person goes, they take their family. If it's a rabbi, they take their students. If it's maybe the students can even take the rabbi. There's provisions for Torah study there. Other people are brought in, so it's not just a city of people who've committed manslaughter. It's a mixed city. There are a lot of the rabbis go through a whole process to make sure that these are very livable places where people don't feel like they can't live their full human life just because they accidentally killed somebody. And in general, prison is seen as something that is part of the non-Jewish world. So the first person we know of who goes to prison is Joseph. He ends up in this dungeon where Pharaoh throws him. We have prophets like Jeremiah gets thrown into prison by the king. This is not considered a desirable situation. This is considered something that is, those people over there do it, or it's the terrible king who doesn't like the prophet. It's not something that should be part of our normal system. And even in medieval times, when prison starts to enter the system because Jews have some autonomy over some of their internal affairs and are now looking around at what other communities do, the rabbis are very, very uncomfortable with the idea of putting people away. And then the final principle that is crucial is that the role of any punishment is tshuva, or return to one's best self. The idea is not punishment for punishment's sake, but rather punishment because it is going to bring you back to who you were before. In the American system, when we put people in prison, we often are essentially reducing them to the worst moment of their lives. And the idea of tshuva is saying, you might have done something really, really bad, but if you do full tshuva, you come back to your best self, and famously, as the medieval philosopher Maimonides said, when somebody has really done tshuva, they can say, that person who did that thing, that wasn't even me. Right? So you're no longer judged for your worst moment. So I'll just say a word about the work that Trua has done over the last several years. We've been educating in Jewish communities across the country about all aspects of incarceration. I don't know if you can see, but we have this kind of massive book that we've put out that many rabbis and educators are using. It has some basic facts about incarceration, and it has a number of Jewish texts that can be used for teaching, as well as examples of what different Jewish communities are doing. I have a few, so maybe the most enthusiastic people can get one at the end. So we have Jewish communities across the country who are teaching from this. We've made this a major theme of a human rights Shabbat that about 200 congregations do every year. And we've gotten involved in aspects and legislation around solitary confinement. I think you'll hear a lot more from Dolores in a moment about a particular court case to end a lot of the aspects of solitary confinement at the Pelican Bay prison. In that case, we were involved in drafting an interfaith amicus brief that thankfully never had to be used because the case settled, but it was drafted. And then we've gotten involved in legislation in a few states. I'll just give one example. Last year in New Jersey, there was a bill that was presented, that was being voted on, that would have eliminated most forms of solitary confinement. So more than 15 days in solitary confinement, would have eliminated solitary confinement for certain vulnerable populations, juveniles, people with mental illness, women who are pregnant, elderly people. And we had rabbis across New Jersey getting their congregations involved in calling their elected representatives to support this bill. We had rabbis who were going to Trenton, to the state capitol, and testifying on behalf of this bill. We had rabbis who were speaking at interfaith events and press conferences, and as I said, getting their congregants involved. And the bill actually passed both houses of the legislature, was vetoed by the now former governor of New Jersey. And now that there's a new governor of New Jersey, we have Jewish communities across the state who are ready to step up and, God willing and people willing, get this bill passed, which will drastically reduce what is really torture in at least one state. And we're working in a number of states like that, and I really believe that the Jewish community, led by rabbis, but not only for rabbis, will be able to make a huge change in getting rid of at least this one little corner, one of the worst corners of incarceration in our country. So I want to just end by just sharing one of my favorite texts by one of my favorite rabbis. This is from Rabbi Chaim David Halevi, who was the Sephardic chief rabbi of Tel Aviv from 1973 until he died in 1998. And he writes a lot about incarceration and policing in extremely beautiful ways. And at the end of one of his tshuvot, one of his legal responses on incarceration, he says, "The foundation of the Holy Torah's perspective on human freedom and the social nature of the human being, created in the image of God, is that no other person has the right to confine the human spirit or his freedom of movement, or his freedom, which are holy of holies among all creations in the image of God. And in each generation, we must devise appropriate punishments for criminals that are consistent with the Torah's outlook and with the conditions of life." That is, whatever kind of criminal justice system we create, we need to remember that nobody has a right to confine the human spirit, and that everybody has I'm summarizing, or just paraphrasing what he says right now, but that nobody has the right to confine the human spirit, and also that whatever we do has to maintain the dignity of every single person who is created in the image of God. Thank you.
Beautiful. Good evening. I'm Michael Lezak. I currently work at Glide, which I'll tell you about in a few minutes. For 14 amazing years, I was a congregational rabbi at Rodef Shalom in San Rafael, a profoundly holy place. I think some of you are here tonight from Rodef. Welcome. Love you guys. About 5 years ago, while I was on sabbatical, I was taking the ferry from the Larkspur terminal into San Francisco, and in my hands I had a book called The New Jim Crow, written by Michelle Alexander, which should rise to the top of your list if you're interested in the subject. And there I was reading it, taking the ferry right past San Quentin. And the book talks about racism that is baked into the mass incarceration system. And there, on that ride and on the ride back, I knew that soon I had to get myself inside San Quentin. Rabbi Jacobs talked about how often jails and prisons are often secluded far off in distant regions. I have often thought that San Quentin is a gift to the Bay Area as a reminder that if it wasn't there, we might think this was the world to come or the promised land, but there in the midst, right on the bay, and this amazing piece of real estate is one of a blot on our society. And so about a month later, I got myself in through a program called The Last Mile, and I taught about 50 men the text from Psalm 118, of which there's many famous lines. Two I'll give you tonight. I was sitting in a circle with them, many men who had committed murder, and some of them were lifers who said, it was really powerful to be studying this text. One of the lines in there is, Min ha-metzar karatia anani b'merchavia. It said, out of the metzar, out of the narrow place, I called out to God, and God answered me from a place of vast expansiveness. So there's this movement in the psalm from being squeezed to being liberated. And there I was in this place of being squeezed in this beautiful Bay Area of ours. And it talked about this image of how do you go from here to here. Later on in the psalm, there's a line that says, Evan ma'asu habonim haitala rosh pinah, which translates to that stone that the builders discarded, that they thought was not good enough for the building, ultimately became the Rosh Pinah. It's often translated as the cornerstone, but actually it's really the capstone of the building. And as I was teaching this line, a man behind me said, Rabbi, when you talk about that stone that was thrown away, it sounds like what the psalmist was talking about is all of us in here. It feels like society thinks of us as disposable human beings. And I said, we talked a lot about this process of teshuvah, of what does it mean to have a pathway to make amends and to become whole again. And so it was while I was teaching this group of 50 men through The Last Mile that I noticed the juxtaposition between the racial makeup of the men I was sitting with inside San Quentin as juxtaposed to the population outside. Marin County, as of 2010, was about 80% white. And there in that room, and in general at San Quentin, the number's roughly 70 to 75% are men of color. So there I was, congregational rabbi to 1,100 families, and really thinking that somehow the Holy One dropped that book into my hands and summoned me to do a little teaching. I gave a sermon on Rosh Hashanah 4 or 5 years ago and built a weekly New Jim Crow working group where we unpacked issues of white privilege and thought deeply about what we might be able to do, how we might be able to use our power as a congregation of committed people committed to justice to bring a little bit of light into the criminal justice system. And bit by bit, we set out on different field trips and over time built pathways in so that still to this day, a group of congregants from Rodef Shalom go in monthly to sing with the Jewish group at San Quentin. This Passover will be the third Passover in a row where a group of amazing people have made Passover Seder for, it's up to 170 men at San Quentin. In the kitchen at Rodef Shalom, Chef Jeff Kirschbaum of the Mighty Mitzvah Kitchen made an untold number of matzah balls and brisket that descended from the heavens that then made its way into San Quentin. And for months afterwards, I would hear stories from men of you make sure to tell that Chef Jeff that was the best meal I've had in 25 or 40 years. And so this idea of what would it mean to turn the dial on the new Jim Crow? What would it mean to bring more justice into the criminal justice system and more compassion? And we built relationships with the San Francisco County Jail and the jail in Vacaville, where we taught a group of people on the prison hospice there about Jewish rituals around death and dying, and taught them about tahara and shmirah. Somewhere in the middle there was through Rabbi Jacobs and Trua that there was a gathering in New York City about what would a Jewish response be to mass incarceration. And there I met many people, including some people who ultimately introduced me to Dolores Canales. And I'll tell you, we're in the presence of one of the great souls I've ever met, who is doing incredibly righteous work. Dolores, she'll tell you more, but rents a bus 4 or 5 times a year and drives 50-plus people from Orange County all the way to Pelican Bay. It's about a 15-hour bus ride. 3-year-olds and 73-year-olds to visit their brothers and their uncles and their fathers. And when I learned about this and I looked at a map, I realized that San Rafael is at about the halfway spot. And so we offered to host Dolores. And so you got on the bus around midnight, and your bus would pull into the parking lot around 7 a.m. And we'd been working diligently for the past days before to prepare a 5-star breakfast for folks who'd never met Jews before, mostly. And we saw people who had been broken by this system, who sometimes couldn't afford to fill their tank to get across town, let alone to drive a 14-hour drive. And you built this moving angelic ship that brought them to visit their families for an extended weekend. And at the end of your hour or 2-hour visit, we fed you. We would go into the sanctuary, and we would put Torahs into the hands of people, some people who did not speak English and had not met Jews before, and we would sing together. And invariably, there would be tears on in all of our eyes of the relationships we had built. So I'm just so grateful that you're in my life and that you're on the stage, and I can't wait for you to share more holy stories. About 8-9 months ago, I left Road of Shalom and started working at Glide Memorial Church, about a 2-hour drive from here, and in some ways on a different planet, from walking from Pacific Heights to the Tenderloin every day is like visiting 2 different Americas. Glide is a church that, amongst many other things, I think of it as really a justice juggernaut that has over 50 programs, from feeding 2,200 meals a day to helping men unlearn violence, men who've hurt people to unlearn violence, and women who've been hurt, and a family, youth, and child care center. I'll tell you about 3 of the programs that are inspiring the most at Glide. One is a program called Harm Reduction. Until my suburban tochas made its way to Glide, harm reduction meant to me you got to wear a bike helmet or like a seatbelt. In the Tenderloin, harm reduction means that we give out close to 1.5 million clean needles every year to people who are addicted to drugs. I didn't even know where I landed on policy issues with regards to drug addiction, but what I learned from the people on our harm reduction team, who are really some of the most righteous people and inspiring people at Glide, these are people who have made tshuva in their own life, people who themselves were addicted for years or decades, and through compassionate programs like Glide has turned their lives around, and now walk the streets and will test people's drugs to make sure that there's not fentanyl in their drugs that would kill them. We'll test people instantaneously for HIV and Hep C and get them treatment. And if and when they ever want to get treatment for their drug abuse, we help connect them to that. There's a drug I learned about that's called Narcan, that when someone ODs on an opioid, that Narcan reverses the power of that drug and helps people who would have died come back to life. I think about the second blessing in the Amidah, which talks about a God who gives life to the dead, which a lot of progressive Jews said phooey to, like, no, we're not going to we don't believe in that. But Narcan is a drug that Glide gave out over 150 times last year that brought people back from the dead. Maybe the last program, second to last program I'll tell you about, we have an alternative to incarceration program called LEAD, Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion, for low-level drug offenders and people who are prostituting themselves to buy drugs. Right now, SFPD, when they pick up someone who's got 10 grams of cocaine or heroin, will call up Glide and say, we're in an alley south of Market, and the Glide lead team gets in a van and meets that person there and surrounds them with love and compassion and sees, rather than a drug addict right there, they see the Tselem Elohim. They see the image of God in that person and surround them with love. And I hear story after story about how the compassion with which people show up helps turn people's lives around and helps them feel loved for the first time maybe ever. And we connect them to programs like Glide. Tomorrow afternoon, we are hosting for the second time a training for police chiefs and district attorneys from around the West Coast. There's a police chief at the University of Oregon named Matt Carmichael, who is a prophetic thinker who said, somehow got connected to Glide and loves the work we do there and understands what we do with our security team downstairs. We've done a really good job at training them how to de-escalate situations with people who have issues with mental illness or addiction issues. And Chief Carmichael said, we know police chiefs and district attorneys need to know more about that. So we are piloting a program end of last year and this year to help police officers and district attorneys be more compassionate in their work. We all know what happened in Sacramento last weekend with the young boy who was shot 20 times in his backyard. The district attorney from Yolo County will be at Glide tomorrow night and was with us in December. And Chief Carmichael said, you know, Rabbi, last time I sent you the guys who were totally bought in on this issue, the ones who are really down with compassion. He's like, this time it's not going to be as easy on you guys, and it's not going to be easy on my guys. I'm going to send you the ones who are a little more entrenched in their work and might be a little bit more judgmental or racist in their system. So you've got work cut out for you. So it's a 3-day training, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. And I really think of Glide as this high-rise holy of holies. It's like a tshuva factory that helps people turn their lives around who've encountered mortsuris, who've been in the Meitzar, in the narrow place, maybe the narrow places than I've ever known. And we help connect them to places of hope. And I'm really proud of the work we did at Road of Shalom on so many levels. This work that we're doing at Glide now, I think about what does it mean to turn the dial on the new Jim Crow and to bring more compassion into the criminal justice system. It was about maybe a year ago that the JCC partnered with Glide to bring Brian Stevenson, I think one of the best prophets we have in America of this time, to talk about his work at the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama. Brian's got 4 points that have become the Torah of my justice work. He says that we have to get proximate, we have to get close. I can't see any of you right now, I trust that you're there, but we have to get close and look one another in the eye. He said we have to have the courage to tell a new narrative, that the narratives we've been working with of Jew and Christian, of black and white, of rich and poor, those don't work and they keep us apart. He said we have to tether ourselves to hope. He said the opposite of hope is injustice. And the last thing he said is that we have to do uncomfortable things. And I can tell you, my first 6 months walking through the Tenderloin and hearing people scream out my door and seeing people inject drugs and dirty sidewalks is incredibly uncomfortable. And I can say to you, there's more meaning coming into my life than maybe ever has. So I extend an invitation from this stage up here to any of you who want to get close and tell a new narrative and try and do uncomfortable things, to come visit us at Glide. We need over 85 volunteers every day. In about 3 weeks, 80 plus people from Glide and my wife's congregation, the Kitchen, are making pilgrimage to the museum that Brian Stevenson is opening in Montgomery, Alabama. There's a memorial that they're building to the 4,400 known victims of lynching, and a museum that tells a story from slavery to mass incarceration and the through line that has not stopped. Brian Stevenson said slavery didn't end in 1865, it just took on new forms. So we're making pilgrimage, a very difficult pilgrimage, and we raised money to bring 25 Glide staff members, many of whom couldn't have ever afforded to go themselves, and some who've never left the Tenderloin, to go with us. And we trust that this pilgrimage is going to change us and change Glide, and God willing to change the city, and to bring some of that light and holiness and a little bit of an American Teshuvah project back here to San Francisco.
thank you all for being here, and thank you very much for having me. This is an amazing panel, just amazing speakers, and I'm already inspired and encouraged just being here with Rabbi Jacobs and Rabbi Lezak. And so my name is Dolores Canales, and I'm co-founder of California Families Against Solitary Confinement. I got involved in the issue of solitary confinement when those that were incarcerated decided to go on a hunger strike, and they were going to start it on July 1st, 2011. And prior to the hunger strike, my son had been in solitary confinement for 10 years, and I didn't really give it too much of a second thought. I kept figuring like they were going to let him out someday because they had to figure it out. But then I started hearing stories of individuals that had been held in solitary confinement for 25 and 35 and 40 years. And I realized they had no intention of changing the system or ending the use of solitary confinement. So prior to the hunger strike, my son sent letters that were written to the governor, to Matthew Cates, and to like 200 organizations. And he said, you know, Mom, please make sure and get all these packages mailed out before the hunger strike. And I remember he announced that he and his fellow prisoners would be going on this hunger strike until their demands were met. And their demands were to, you know, end group punishment, because they were always getting punished as a group rather than individual accountability, and to end the use of solitary confinement indefinite, they called it, because at that time California was using solitary confinement indefinitely on arbitrary purposes, which meant you could be held in solitary confinement for 20 and 30 years behind drawings, having possession of the book The Soledad Brothers, or something that they still use, other prisoners' statements against them, but those people remain unidentified. But what really got me about these demands was they were going on a hunger strike, and one of the demands was proper and nutritious diet. That was one of their 5 core demands that they were willing to die for. And then another one of their demands was education and programming, because they had been confined in these cells for decades at a time with no programming. It is provided at that time if the families could pay for it. We, thank God that I had friends that helped me pay for courses for my son. He studied in civil litigation, paralegal studies, numerous law courses that we were able to provide, and writing courses, things like that. So my son did have that. But if somebody's sitting in there and doesn't have someone, you could just sit in that cell and languish until your mind takes over and drives you insane. And so I immediately got involved because I also have experienced incarceration. And I spent over 20 years of my life in prison behind a drug addiction. I mean, once I stopped using drugs, I quit going to jail. So it was behind a drug addiction that, you know, I could have been given rehabilitation for or something like that. But I don't look at that as a waste. If anything, it made me realize, you know, what we do to human beings, confining human beings in cement and steel and cages, is what really got me involved in the movement of the hunger strikes and solitary confinement, because I realized, for one, that California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation was not going to meet demands. That's just not what they do, and that they might very well let them starve to death. And what I also realized, as you were speaking about, what I felt at the time was that God gave me the strength and inspired me to get involved in this issue, because the very character is that we befriend one another. You know, to be human is to have other people's existence around us. And when I saw that on the carton of eggs, many of you probably voted for Proposition 2 in the November 2008 ballot for the confinement of chickens. And if you read your carton of eggs, and they're for the certified humane standard for the chickens, is you're being guaranteed that the chickens had comfortable resting places, proper and nutritious diet. I mean, they had the hunger strike demands, and that they had the ability to engage in natural behavior. And when I read that, and when I found that, it just broke my heart as a mother, because I thought, you know, the ability to engage in natural behavior, but yet here we're holding human beings without access to sunlight, without even so much as being able to hold your loved one's hand. And I thought, my God, what are we doing? It really woke me up to even my own experience. I was, I had spent time in prison and didn't really think too much of it. It was that learned behavior that oh gosh, I can't think of the word right now. In other words, because I did use drugs and, that I actually, this was the right thing to do to me, to keep, incarcerating me rather than, seeking out. I deserved it. That's the word I was thinking of. And so, how this began, and I started meeting other family members, and they would tell me, my dad, I haven't held my dad's hand since I was 5 years old, and here I'm speaking to a 25-year-old young lady. Or meeting a mother that, she's on her deathbed and for 20 years hasn't been able to hug her son. And as I started meeting these family members and hearing these stories, I realized that we needed to do something, and we needed to continue to push through until something was done. And so we immediately got involved, going to Sacramento, having protests at the State Building and rallies, getting involved with other organizers and advocates, and also with National Religious Campaign Against Torture. And that is how I got involved with Rodolphe Shalom. We were on a conference call, a national conference call, because I started organizing family visits for the family members, because many they couldn't afford to see their loved one, or they couldn't make the long trip up to Pelican Bay from Southern California. And here you had family members that didn't even talk about having an incarcerated loved one. And when we first pulled up to Rodolphe Shalom, and we're getting off at 7 o'clock in the morning, and here's all this whole synagogue of people like running out to meet them and hugging them and greeting them and saying, come inside, there's food. So many family members just broke down crying. I remember that first bus trip so good. That's actually encouraged me to keep doing them even more, because the experience was so beautiful, and what the families kept saying was, they don't even know us, and they just love us so much. They don't care that we have an incarcerated loved one. And that love that was pouring out, it was just so beautiful, and singing in Hebrew, and just the love there that has continued. And I think we've been doing this for 4 years now, taking the buses up and visiting. And Rabbi Lezak is no longer at Rodolphe, but Rodolphe has continued on with all the amazing people. We even have some that join us on the bus trips, and that come and have befriended the families, and actually they could do a bus trip without me. I don't even know what I would do, without all their help. And how this all started, though, it all started when I first began. I didn't know what to do. I was a mom, and I had a son that announced he was going to starve to death, and I threw on an orange jumpsuit and got a bullhorn and started, marching in the street and talking about what was going on. I started reaching out. I could have never have done this alone. I believe that solitary confinement breaks the heart of God. I believe that our system of mass incarceration breaks the heart of God. And I used to tell people that in the very beginning. They used to tell me, oh, things are never going to change. It's always been this way. And I'd say, no, I think they are, because it's breaking God's heart. I believe it is, or I wouldn't be doing this. And a lot of people remember that, when I first started, that I always used to say that, because that's what I felt with all my heart. And through this work, though, what has transpired in my own life and the opportunities that have become available, I was able to be a part of the documentary, The 13th. So when Rabbi Lezak mentions, that the 13th Amendment, where slavery was abolished, except for if you're in jail or prison. So, slavery does still exist through another name, and that's incarceration. And I was also able to be interviewed by Oprah Winfrey, and it's on the 60-minute website. But the reason that I'm mentioning these things is because I was a mom that was willing to get involved, and I did not know exactly what to even do in the beginning. But because of so many people that were willing to embrace the family members, and that were willing to help and say, what could I do? I could still remember the very first day that I met, at the time she was the director for the LA chapter of the National Religious Campaign Against Torture, Virginia Classic, at the State Senate, August 23rd, 2011. And she came up to me and she said, NRCAT, which is National Religious Campaign Against Torture, wants to support the families. We are here for you. We are willing to do whatever you need. When I think it was the third hunger strike, and hundreds of rabbis signed on that they were against the use of solitary confinement. They considered solitary confinement torture. Synagogues all over Southern California were having the family members come in and speak. And seeing that involvement, and not only that though, that for the first time ever, so many family members were feeling like people were listening, like people cared, and that there was such a difference, there was such hope that rose up in the families. Because for so long, for so many decades, they held on to that shame. As Rabbi Jacobs was speaking of, they held on to that shame of having an incarcerated loved one. And so what the hunger strikes did for so many families was it strengthened and it encouraged us that if they were willing to starve to death, if they were willing to do what they were doing, who were we to keep quiet? Who were we to not do anything? And, you know, this work, as it continues and as mass incarceration continues, sometimes you grow weary and sometimes you think like, am I going to make a difference, you know? And then we continue to organize and to get together and to have movements or to have symposiums and to continue to do the work. And just recently, I just want to share, so a lot, because of Ashker versus Brown, Todd Ashker and Donnie Trexwell were both in Pelican Bay solitary confinement for decades, and they filed a lawsuit, and they had been filing it, and it was 3 years into the courts being approved, moving on, when Jules Lobel with the Center for Constitutional Rights stepped in and got other attorneys in the area, and they opened it up as a class action lawsuit. So through that class action lawsuit, the use of indefinite solitary confinement was actually abolished. CDC can no longer use this, and thousands of individuals were released from solitary confinement out into general population, where they now were having contact visits with their loved ones. They were being able to have educational programs and vocational training and various things, although that's still a struggle too. That's something else we're still dealing with legally. We're trying to get more programming and more vocational training into the prisons. And then many of these individuals started going to board and getting denied a parole date because they said that they were socially inadaptable because they were in solitary confinement for so long. And so then we got discouraged with that, and now we formed a parole committee, and we have weekly calls, and we went to Sacramento, and we felt like, you know, here they were held for decades arbitrarily, which CDC even admitted, and most recently on 60 Minutes, when Oprah Winfrey interviewed the Secretary of Corrections, Scott Kernan, he admitted their use of solitary confinement had been a big mistake. So then we started feeling a little bit discouraged with that and feeling like, okay, now we're forming another committee, and that's another issue we're going to raise. And most recently, we had somebody parole that had been in solitary confinement for 37 years, had been in prison 40 years, and he found his peace and his strength authoring several books of poetry and art. And he's in the audience, Jack Morris. But when that happened, that kind of like sparked something in us again, like, okay, you know, we've had one parole, you know, we believe now they're gonna come home. We believe, you know, just the different shifting and the changes that you're always organizing for, or believing in, and not giving up hope. And, you know, the different things that you strive for, and everything that you always keep in faithful prayer, you know, believing that we've had this much change happen, more than that's happened in decades. And though you grow weary, you know, I think, since they both mentioned biblical scriptures, when I read this one part in the book of Micah, and God is saying to the people, my people, what have I done to you? How have I wearied you? Remember your journey. I think of, you know, how our prison system and the system of mass incarceration has just taken over, where human beings have become marketable commodities. And that's how many people make their living, off of incarceration. And so you have this one part that continues to get incarcerated, and the other part that's trying to make a living off of incarceration. And so I think of that, and I think, you know, that incarceration breaks the heart of God, because we were never meant to be a commodity. We were never meant to be somebody's ROI. And, you know, so I just am very grateful to be here tonight.
Well, I have 1,000 questions I want to ask both of you, but I think that given the time, we should open it up to questions from the audience. Great. Which I think, Stephanie, I can't see you, but I know you're out there.
If you have a question, just raise your hand. We'll come to you with the mic. Or a comment. Don't be shy. Anyone? Okay, sorry, I'm just going to crawl over.
Maybe say your name before your question so we can relate back to you.
Yes, my name's Jack Morris, and I've known Dolores about 5 months. So I have to ask, is there a time period on which buses will no longer travel to help the families of incarcerated men and women?
When there's no more prisons.
First of all, thank you very much for being here. I am a member of GLAD. My name is Ricky Carter, and I've had the opportunity to hear Rabbi Lezak speak, so thank you for all your work. But I just want to say that I've noticed, and what's saddening me is this the opioid epidemic, which has now become a big cause, because it saddens me that the fact that when there was a crack issue going on in the drugs that were affecting the inner city, how that was a scourge and that needed to be dealt with a strong hand, whereas it was even on 60 Minutes, one of these shows a few years back, where now that the opioid epidemic was affecting Johnny in Vermont, and it was affecting different types of culture, that it was not to be hard fast, but the police would even send the kids to pick them up off the street and send them to halfway homes and get help, whereas that was not the same process that was for the inner city kids or people of a different color. So I just hadn't seen it being so blatant, that the fact that now we have, because it is affecting a different race of people, that all of a sudden it's even in the government now, where our president has announced that we need to take care of this with counseling and all these things, where the same thing wasn't happening years back when the crack or different epidemics were affecting the people in the inner city. So thank you again for all of this, because it's nice to see that the communities can come together to help us all, because as they say, a high tide raises all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I just have a question regarding once the prisoners are released, I feel like there should be some reform or some form of rehabilitation that takes place after, because once they're released, they don't really have the same rights or anything. It affects their job, it affects their ability to get a home, it affects their day-to-day lives. So I just want to know your take on that, or what are the steps going after?
Yeah, I can start. That's a really important point. I think a lot of times when we think about incarceration, we think about people who are currently behind bars, but actually it's a much bigger system, because there's a little over 2 million people who are actually in prison, but there's close to 7 million people who are somehow in the system, which means they might be on parole or are somehow under the watch of the criminal justice system. And like you mentioned, often people don't have full rights. So if people have a felony conviction, they might not be able to live in public housing, which means they maybe can't go home to their family, or they maybe are, depending on the state, might not be able to get certain jobs or might not be able to vote. And I think we need to think about a whole-scale way to ensure that people, first of all, are kept out of prison, that we have lots and lots of options, like you both talked about, to make sure that as few people are in prison as possible, or maybe we create a system where nobody's in prison. And then certainly when people are out, that we want a way for them to be able to be out and to lead meaningful lives. So there are a lot of attempts to do that. One of the programs that I love in New York is a program that's based at John Jay College, which is part of the City University of New York, where the last, I think, 2 years of your sentence, you start college inside. You're inside of prison, but you're taking classes from John Jay College, and then when you get out, you automatically are then on campus finishing your degree at John Jay, and then so then you have a CUNY degree, and there's a lot of help placing you in great jobs. And so we need more and more ways to ensure that people who are coming out of prison have a way to contribute to the society and not end up back in prison because there's no other options.
That's one of the reasons that I took the position. I'm working now with the Bail Project, because oftentimes when you're sitting in jail, your pre-trial detention, if you can't bail out, you take the plea bargain just because, and then that starts building a record, and then that starts making it harder to get a job and everything else that somebody with a record faces, where we're finding that over 50% of cases that have the opportunity to be out on bail through the Bronx Freedom Fund, we found that they end up even getting dismissed. And so that's a big thing, starting right where it starts, and that's with pretrial detention and restoring the presumption of innocence. Because once you do have that record, and once it does make it a lot more difficult. There is a lot more reentry programs now, although definitely not enough. And there's not enough, as I was mentioning, programming within the facilities. I know some people have gotten involved with the Anti-Recidivism Coalition, founded by Scott Budnick, and that's exactly one of the things that they do, that they work on. They make sure that when you go through the Anti-Recidivism Coalition, that you are able to find employment and that you're ready for employment, by getting to work on time and things like that. So there's different organizations that are organizing around that.
I know specifically at Glide there's a woman named Angela who works both with the Women's Center and the Walk-In Center, who's at the, I don't know the exact name of it, but the site where people, when they get out of jail in the city, and she meets them and tells them not just about services that Glide has to offer for food and shelter, but any kind of programs they need to connect them with. So I think we're all in alignment about beefing up the systems that help surround people with compassion and get them back to life.
Thank you.
Rabbis, Ms. Canales, thank you so much for coming out this evening. I really do appreciate you highlighting the very serious nature of this issue. I think one thing that you talked about that I wanted to speak about was the isolation nature, where we hide away the prisoner. And I feel like there's a mindset of isolation that we adopt in the public, where, I'm a resident of California. I went to a Cal State school. All my furniture in my dorm was built by prisoner. My food that I consume, the products that I buy are picked by prisoners. And we have adopted an isolation mindset that almost removes ourselves from the other. And I wonder, can you guys talk about what motivated you to remove yourself from that isolationism and kind of adopt this greater communal scale of thinking?
I think there's no stories that inspire me more than about people who turn their lives around. Brian Stevenson says in his book, Just Mercy, says, we're more than the worst thing we've ever done in our life. We're human beings, and we've all done bad things on different scales and all capable of it. And that capacity, tshuva, to turn your life around and to make amends is inspiring. And as I said before, at Glide we have 160 employees. I don't know how many of them have been through the criminal justice system, but week by week I hear of more and more people who turn their life around. And I think that helps me to feel alive and to empower people to walk through brokenness and to come back alive, I think is something that the criminal justice and rehabilitation system doesn't do as effectively as we would expect it to. I lived in Copenhagen for 6 months as an undergrad, and I worked at the Danish Center for Human Rights, and we went to a Danish prison, and the warden at the prison said, I went into the cell of the most intense criminal in Denmark, had a TV and a VCR and a fridge and a window out to the garden. And he said, here we try to treat them like human beings. In America, you put them behind bars and cages and you treat them like animals. They will behave like animals. And I think this capacity to the reminder to see human beings pulls me in regularly and to help people turn.
I think there's a lot of ways to get involved. As a matter of fact, I'm a part of CURB, which is Californians United for a Responsible Budget, and they look county by county, you know, at the jail expansion, the prison expansion, things like that. And rather than investing more money into expanding jails and prisons, using those resources to invest into communities, into people, things like that. So that's one way, even just locally, right where you're at. Find out what's going on at the jail, find out your supervisors, your local assembly and senate, and how they vote in these issues, and letting your voice be known, even if it's something with phone calls or letters. You know, if you can't miss work to go to hearings, something with phone calls or letters, and showing your support for community investment rather than incarceration. I think that's what's brought about a lot of change so far, you know, even with legislation. I know in California with solitary confinement, we did have a bill that they can't put juveniles in solitary confinement, and it failed the first time, but then it went through the second time. But that was because of the voice of the people. There's a group right now, Initiate Justice, in the Bay Area, and they're trying to get a bill, enough signatures for a bill, so that the incarcerated community would actually even be able to vote. So there's so much going on everywhere. There's the Human Rights Pen Pal Club that was formed also in the Bay Area. The Bay Area has so much happening that where they write people inside and oftentimes go up in carpools to visit. If you're near San Rafael, we're going to be doing another bus trip real quick. So if you want to go volunteer at Rodolphe Shalom, that's because they cook a big breakfast and have a lot of lunches and greet the family. So there's so many ways to get involved, and even just talking to people. I could be in line at the bank and start talking about incarceration, and even if they don't have anybody inside, their tax dollars are going towards incarceration. So when you start pointing at the money and looking at the money and the spending, there's a lot of ways to talk about it, even if they're not personally connected. They're paying for it.
Dolores, I loved your image of God's heart breaking, and I really love that. I'm going to quote you, and in particular because, as you said, as we talked about, people are really just thrown away, and a lot of times when we talk about incarcerated people, it's like a class of people. That's all we know about them, is that they're incarcerated. And the first thing that God tells us about human beings in the very first chapter of the Bible is that every single one of us is a creation in the image of God, which means that every single one of us is unique and infinitely valuable. The Talmud talks about how God, if you're making coins, you make coins from the same mold and they all turn out exactly the same, right? All pennies and nickels and whatever turn out the same, whereas God makes all human beings from the same mold and they all turn out different and equally valuable. And for me, it's been so important to just get to know people, whether it means visiting people inside of prison, talking to families who have people in prison, talking to people who have experienced any aspect of the criminal justice system, whether through their own personal experience, their work, whatever it is, because we just get past the labels about this person is incarcerated, and this person is a lawyer, and this person is this, and this person is that, to the human story. And there's so many ways to access that story, even something that you can do from your home. Like you said, writing letters. We had a synagogue in Riverside, California that wrote letters to more than 100 men in solitary confinement. And they got back letters that were just so heartbreakingly beautiful from people saying, nobody has ever reached out like that to me. And just that little human connection, even through a letter, can start to break those categories apart and allow us to connect. And once we're connected with human beings, we have to do something. We can't just step away, because now we have a responsibility toward another human being.
So we have time for just one more question. I wanted to invite everybody afterwards to the atrium. We've got some cookies and coffee, and hope we can continue the conversation out there.
Hi, California is one of the largest economies in the world, and we have so many foreign countries that you had mentioned are doing it so much better than the United States, even other states. Colorado, I think, outlawed solitary confinement. Texas is even doing it better just from a financial reason. They looked at the death penalty. Is there anywhere in California that's doing anything innovative or anything better? Are there any of the state prisons doing anything unique? Or there's so much information out there. It's just so wasteful not to be taking advantage of this.
In California, I mean, I know of other states, Colorado, like you mentioned, Maine. There's a myth that it's the liberal states, the more progressive states that would be the first to get rid of solitary confinement, and it's actually not true. It's Colorado, Mississippi, Maine. I'm not sure if I missed any. Those are the ones that I know. And some of it is financial, and some of it is that the states have learned that solitary confinement doesn't make anybody safer. Not the prisoners, certainly, and not the people who are working in the prisons. I spent some time, the person who was the commissioner of prisons in Maine then came to New York City, though he's now leaving for a lot of reasons, but I got to spend some time in various meetings with him talking about his experience in Maine and what he was trying to bring that same model to New York, and he said that when he first introduced the idea of getting rid of solitary in Maine, all of the correction officers were against it, because how do we control the prisoners if we can't put them in solitary? And he said, once they got rid of solitary, the corrections officers were never going back, because they realized that everybody was in a better position. But Dolores, you can talk more about the specifics of what's happening in California.
Well, because of the lawsuit, Ashker versus Brown, there was a settlement agreement reached with CDC. They didn't end up going to trial, and that is where thousands got out of solitary confinement. The numbers have been greatly reduced, and as I explained earlier, you have families now that hadn't, been able to touch their loved one in decades, and they're able to visit and everything. So California has made huge changes compared to the way that it used to be, although there's still some loopholes that they're still able to use it pending investigation. You could sit for, a year or 2 years in administrative segregation, which is even worse than the security housing unit, which everyone calls SHU. And they still use certain things to put you back in solitary. So it's just like, it's constant, although the numbers have been greatly reduced, and from what it once was. So California has made a lot of changes. There was a bill passed as far as juveniles, as I mentioned earlier, that you cannot hold juveniles in California in solitary confinement. So there has been, although nothing as significant as Colorado or Maine. But in Colorado, you have Rick Ramish, who is the director of corrections for Colorado, that he insisted on change and totally revamped the prison system there. And I was recently on a panel with him in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and he said that he's worked every field of the system, from being a district attorney to a gang unit officer to a warden, a correctional officer. And he said throughout his entire employment history with corrections, he sees that none of it, not at any angle does it work, but it's only created to produce mass incarceration, the way that our system is right now, from every angle of it. So, hearing him and listening to him speak, but yet seeing the changes that he did make in Colorado makes me very hopeful, that it's going to continue to change. It has in states. We're also on a national committee, a national campaign, trying to help as many states as possible that have campaigns going in their regions. But we have come a long way in California compared to where we were even just 5 years ago.
I think on that note, we are going to thank our panel for being here, and to USF and to Aaron. And I think we can all agree that they are doing holy work. So thank you all. Thank you.